Hello, everyone. It's Mrs. Hill, and I'm here with a read aloud for you this morning called Mr. George and the Red Hat. And this is written and illustrated by Stephen Heigh. Remember that the author writes the words and the illustrator draws the pictures. And Stephen Heigh did both. He was the author and the illustrator of this book. Mr. George is a friendly little squirrel who lives in a park. The park looks just like the one near you, with trees and walking paths. Some parts of the park have grass, and others are covered with bushes. The park is filled with animals, like birds and rabbits and squirrels, like Mr. George. One day, while on his way to collect acorns and peanuts, Mr. George found a small doll hat made of bright red felt. It was just lying on the ground at the foot of a tree, and Mr. George thought it was the prettiest hat he had ever seen. Mr. George was curious. Where did the hat come from? Thought Mr. George. At first, he thought it could be a rabbit's hat, but then he wondered, how could a rabbit with such tall ears wear a hat? So you see up here, this is what he's picturing. There's a rabbit trying to wear this hat. He's imagining that in his mind. Then Mr. George thought, maybe it's a groundhog's hat. But no, what would a groundhog do with a hat? It wouldn't fit their large round head, and the groundhog would surely get it dirty going underground. Here he is, imagining the groundhog wearing the hat. Turn the page. Could it belong to a chipmunk? No way. It would completely cover a chipmunk. Mr. George laughed. Look, chipmunk's so small that the hat would completely cover him. Mr. George thought long and hard about what kind of animal could use such a hat. An animal could use it to hold food that it picked up to save for another time to eat. It would have to be an animal that has short ears and a small head. The animal would have to be very smart and think about these things. Who could use this hat? Thought Mr. George. You see he's sitting there, kind of like the statue of the thinker, thinking, who could use this hat? Mr. George thought and thought. He decided to put the hat on his head while he thought. It fit him perfectly. Then Mr. George looked at his reflection in the stream. That's it, thought Mr. George when he saw himself in the stream. This hat was meant for him. Wow, a red hat for Mr. George. Look, he can see his reflection in the stream, just like when you look in a mirror, you can see your reflection in the mirror. Mr. George wore the hat all spring. He took the hat wherever he went. When he went looking for food, Mr. George would gather acorns and peanuts and put them in his hat to carry them. Mr. George would climb a tree and hang his hat upside down from a branch and have a picnic in the tree. He could see the whole park under the bright blue sky. These are wonderful illustrations, aren't they? They're so detailed. Mr. George had lots of animal friends in the park. They all loved seeing Mr. George in his beautiful red hat. There were the rabbits, the chipmunks, the raccoons, and the skunk, some mice and a frog, and even a turtle. They would all gather around Mr. George while he wore the red hat. When summer arrived, Mr. George heard from the other animals that a new mother bird was looking for a home for her family. When he heard someone needed a home, Mr. George had an idea. He went off to find the young mother bird. It didn't take long for Mr. George to find her. With goodness in his heart, Mr. George gave his hat as a gift to the new mother bird. He told her it would make a fine new home for her family. Wasn't that so very kind of Mr. George to do? The mother bird hung the red hat from a tree, and in it made a safe, warm nest for her little baby birds. It did indeed make a beautiful home for the newborn family. All the animals in the park cheered for Mr. George and his kindness. They showered him with wildflowers. Mr. George was a wonderful friend and neighbor to everyone in the park. Maybe someday you will see Mr. George, who gave his red hat to the bird family. The end. Mr. George was very kind in this story, giving up his hat that he found to the mother bird so that she had a nice, warm, cozy nest for her family. And I encourage you to show an act of kindness today, too. Think of something kind that you can do for a friend or a family member, just like Mr. George did for someone.